everybody. Let's get tonight's program started. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, to our celebration of the 50th anniversary of Apollo 17, the final mission to the moon. Well, I say that, the final mission 50 years ago, I guess, seeing as we're on our way again. But it's great to be with you all for tonight's program, whether you are with us here in the WRAL 3D Theater or to those of us who are taking out our program out there on the internet. Thank you for joining us and being a part of tonight's very special program. For tonight, we're going to hear from a set of exciting speakers who are going to share with us insights, perspective, and expertise on so much of the science that goes into celebrating something like the Apollo program and the great work in science and engineering. And then, when we're done here in the theater, we will all be able to go out into the plaza where the Raleigh Astronomy Club is going to have some fun and exciting demonstrations in science to share with us outside as well. I don't think you can do an Apollo program without a little bit of the moon. So I hope that everybody will be able to stick around for that as well. Now, my name is Chris Smith. I work here as the coordinator for current science programming, which only means that when we do great programs like this, I get the pleasure and privilege of welcoming everyone into the museum and of helping you meet our very special guests. To get started with tonight's program, I would like for you to meet Stacy Sabarsky. Stacy's an actress at the Burning Coal Theater, which is currently running a production of Silent Sky through next week. In fact, I will be going to see this play tomorrow, all about the human computers of the Harvard Observatory in the 19th century. So I'm excited to be there. I'll actually be doing a discussion after the show with one of tonight's guest speakers, Dr. Rachel Smith. So I'd say if you don't have your tickets, you might look into it, but the play is on through December 18th, so make sure that you check out Burning Coal Theater, and welcome Stacy to the stage.
Oh, can you hear me all right? Okay. Excellent. Thank you. As he said, my name is Stacy Sabarsky, and I am performing in A Silent Sky by Lauren Gunderson. I play Wilhelmina Fleming, and Wilhelmina was actually one of the original, she was the original Harvard computer who went to work for Dr. Pickering. She has a really interesting backstory. She came to America with her husband when she was 21 from Scotland, and she unfortunately found herself abandoned and pregnant. Her husband, once they got to this country, left her. And so she went to look for work, and she ended up working, finding a job with Dr. Pickering at his home. And Dr. Pickering was the professor at Harvard Observatory, working to chart the skies and the stars at that time. And it came to be that he realized she was actually very smart. She did teach school back in Scotland. And at one point, he was very frustrated with all his male employees, and he said, "My maid could do a better job than all of you." And sure enough, he hired her to come in and do some of the computing work. And she ended up discovering over 10,000, charting over 10,000 stars. She discovered nebulae and some of the pulsing stars and all kinds of wonderful things. She was also responsible for trying to figure out how to catalog the stars and with the Draper catalog, which is still using her methods today. When I started doing research on her, because as actors we try to research, if we're playing real people, what this person's life was like, I actually found this lovely children's book. So if any of you have children or grandchildren, it's called She Caught the Light, and it's all about Wilhelmina Fleming. And it's really, really lovely. It talks about her childhood growing up in Dundee, Scotland, and then coming to America. But the story itself, the play Silent Sky, follows really three women. The central character, Henrietta Leavitt, who is also responsible for really pushing the boundaries and making the connection between the brightness of the Cepheid stars and their time periods. And through this connection that she made, we were able to then extrapolate out. She kept saying, we can't be the only galaxy, but all the men, sorry guys, but all the men kept saying, the Harvard University men were saying, no, there can't be anything outside our own Milky Way. Well, through the connection that she made between the pulsing of the Cepheid stars and the intensity, they came to do the extrapolations, and some of her stars were billions of light years away. So then it became accepted that, in fact, there are billions of other galaxies out there. So it's really all due to these amazing women. There were 9 women who ended up working as mentioned, as computers was their title, until some of them rose to curator and other things, who are responsible for a lot of the mapping of the sky that we still use today and the methods that we still use today. I don't know if anybody has any questions. I'm not a scientist, I am an actor, so I don't know if I could answer a scientific question, but I could possibly answer something about Wilhelmina, or maybe the other 2 ladies, again, Henrietta Leavitt and Annie Jump Cannon are the 3 women featured in the play. We are performing tonight. We actually opened last weekend, so we are performing tonight at 7:30. The show runs about 90 minutes with an intermission, so a little longer than 90 minutes when you add in the intermission. So we have shows Thursday, Friday, and Saturday evenings at 7:30, and then Sunday matinee at 2. And as was mentioned earlier, tomorrow night there's going to be a wonderful talk back after our show as well. Any other thoughts or
Other questions, let me know. I'll bring you a microphone.
Was there a hand back there or no? Oh, yes, right here. Oh, okay, great.
Can you
do you want to explain? Yeah. Well, basically, following the performance, you're going to be leading it, correct?
I will.
Yes.
So I'll be at the show. I'll see you there. And I'll be there with Dr. Rachel Smith, the museum's astrophysicist. And after the program, Rachel and I will be having a conversation about astrophysics, about the program, the play, about working in science, working at a museum, aka it's awesome. I hope that's what Rachel says. And so we'll just be having a maybe not a short conversation, but not a long conversation either, weaving the content of the play into what's happening today in astrophysics.
Any other questions? It's a great way really to unpack the show, you know, what you've just witnessed, and then what does that mean in reality in the real world today? What's the correlations? So it's wonderful to have experts come and speak to what you just experienced. Yeah?
Was she trained? I mean, how did she, come to have this incredible ability to catalog the galaxy?
Right. Well, it
So
said that, yeah.
The question is, how was your character, Wilhelmina Fleming, trained and gained the skills to be an astrophysicist?
Right. Well, basically, it was a lot of computations. She had a very high IQ, and I'm sure she was shown what to do. But they were basically photographing parts of the sky with the big telescope, the refractor telescope that they had at the observatory. So they would get these sort of window pane sections of the sky, and they would chart everything. They would chart its spectral class, which they also was something that they determined and set up. Annie Jump Cannon came up with that classification system, and they would chart, you know, if it was a blinking star, a Cepheid star, what kind of star it was. They would name them, what magnitude, what declination it was in the sky, and they just kept logbooks of all of it. Like, from my research, Wilhelmina charted over 10,000 stars, which I'm like, wow, all by hand. There were no actual computers. They were the computers at that time. So it was just a lot of painstaking research, looking at these plates and analyzing it and note-taking. really. Any other questions? Yes, again, the play is being done just down the road from here at Burning Coal Theater on Polk Street in the old Murphy School. So it's a great local theater. If you've never been, you should definitely check it out and come see the production. It's suitable for all ages because especially if you have young women who you might want to encourage to pursue something in the sciences, because it really shows how these women, against all odds, I forgot to mention, they weren't even allowed, the women were not even allowed to use the telescope. They were not allowed to use it, not allowed to touch it. The thing that they said, the men said, because it was open to the sky, up at the top of the dome was open, they thought that the women would catch cold or get sick being outside to use the telescope. That's what they said anyway. So women did all the analysis, men took the photographs and used the telescope. But yeah. Any other questions or? Well, I hope to see you all at the theater. It's called Silent Sky. My character is Wilhelmina Fleming from Scotland, and if I see you there, please stick around and say hello afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Excellent stuff. That's a fantastic way to get started with tonight's program, too, I think, as we are now going to rocket forward in time to the, oh, thank you. Great big round of applause from the crowd on that one. Although I did get a note, I have to share this. This is really cool. One of our online viewers tonight is Captain Ron Sheeran. Hi, Ron. Thanks for watching. Ron is a longtime resident of Chapel Hill, but in the 60s and 70s was in the control room for the Apollo launches as a nuclear physicist, as a liaison officer between NASA, the Air Force, and the U.S. Public Health Service, and just celebrated 90 years. So happy birthday, Ron. Thanks for tuning into our program. That's exciting. Let's move forward with tonight's program. Everybody, I would like to introduce you the head of the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, Astronomy and Astrophysics Research Lab, and a professor at Appalachian State University who is going to take us on a tour of just all of space, but particularly the moon. Everybody put your hands together and welcome Dr. Rachel Smith to the stage.
All right, I think I'm on. There's feedback. Good? Can you hear me? So this has to wake up a minute. So I'm Rachel Smith, and welcome to the experts, especially the person who was at the control room. I mean, these are our living relics of a great time in our history. And can we turn these lights off, please, by the screen? Thank you. Awesome. So what I'm going to present to you today is, and I'll start off by saying, by the way, I'm an astrophysicist. I study forming stars. I am allowed at the telescope, thankfully. I observe in Hawaii. I'm not an historian, although I really love history. I'm very interested in the moon. I really wanted to do something for Apollo 17. We have a moon rock here. One of the good, that's fine. Oh, that's great. I needed a spotlight for all of my notes. So thank you. And so I'm really excited to talk about it. I'm not a mission expert, I will start off by saying, but I really hope to give you a nice overview of this really interesting and important and historic mission. The software I'm going to show you today is called OpenSpace, and it is a NASA-funded project. It is led by the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, and it is an ongoing, it's still being funded. And so what I just wanted to mention is that after this program, specifically for this OpenSpace portion for NASA and for our team, if you go to this QR code, and I'll leave it here, and you want to leave an evaluation, I don't see it, so be honest about it. If you don't like it, I mean, don't say that, but you can. Anyway, I tell my students, I hope you love it. If you don't, that's fine, but don't write that down. But anyway, no, I'm joking. Be honest, that would be very helpful to the project. What you learned, they ask you some basic questions as for our evaluators from the American Museum of Natural History. So I'll just leave that right there. I would appreciate that. Okay, so what I'm showing you here, this is open space. This is our moon. And this is all real data, by the way. So I'm not going to talk too much about open space today. I'm not going to show you much more than Apollo 17 today for time. And we're just going to really talk about the mission. But I just want to say that everything here you can see, you can go from Earth to the universe, to the end of the universe, to this cosmic microwave background. All the stars are in their right spot. There are menus that I pull up. And this is set actually for December 12th, 1972, right during the Apollo, right around when they got there. I think they got there December 11th. But right about now, they'd be in space flying to the moon. 50 years ago today, the astronauts would be on their way to the moon. And I'm going to end this talk, by the way. I'm going to switch. They have some slides of mine in the back, and we're going to watch a few videos that I picked from the NASA archives. It's only about 4 or 5 minutes total of the astronauts on the moon and the audio that went with that. And in my opinion, this was a time that I hope we come back to, sending humans to the moon, where we have been sending robots to the moon. So we have satellites on the moon. All the data you see here, with a few exceptions, and what I'll talk about with some imagery that one of the astronauts, Harrison Schmitt, took, or Jack Schmitt, he goes by, of one of the boulders. All of this is lunar reconnaissance orbiter data. But everything is in the right spot, and it's set for this time so that when we get to the landing site, the stars are in the place the astronauts would have seen them. They're a little exaggerated so we can see them. And the lighting on the moon is what they would see. And then I'm going to bring up a map, and we'll take a little tour of their 3 vehicular activities. This was one of 3 NASA Apollo missions where rovers were sent. And thinking about the time period, it's 1972. This was the last of the Apollo missions, and they sent a car to the moon. They sent these humans who came back safely. They brought cameras. They took amazing data. And to me, this is even more remarkable than what we're doing now. And with the exception, of course, we're going back, hopefully, with Artemis. And we'll talk a second about that at the end. Okay, so just as a quick overview, let's go. Well, first of all, we're going to zoom in. I'm going to turn on a data set as we get closer. This is our moon. The moon formed. And we'll hear again from another astronomer here. Patrick will talk a little bit more about this. Formed from an impact. We won't talk a lot about moon formation here in this talk, but I'm going to get to, I'm going to turn on my data set here. Sorry, I have to get to my next data set. I wanted to, let's see, where's my moon? Hold on a second. I'm now, we got to go to the LEM. And I'm going to zoom. Oh, it didn't. All right. Apologies. All right. So let's zoom over. And there's our little map here. And I'll turn on, let me get to the moon here. I'm going to his shading. I'm going to turn this off. And go to my layers here, color layers. And there's one data set I need to turn on, which I have to find amongst all of the data here. There we go. Okay, so this, oops, sorry. Not a word you want to hear on Apollo, right, when you're flying in space. Although I am always available to be an astronaut. If anyone wants me to fly, I'll do it, no problem. Oops is just a fun little term. Okay, so driving opens, I turn on these menus, and this is free software, by the way, and you can download it, openspaceproject.com. But we're going to talk a little bit about Apollo. So now we're in 1972. This gray band here is the lighting that the astronauts would have seen when they landed, and it's accurate lighting. I'm going to turn this off so we see the whole map as soon as I get down there. And we'll stop at the LEM which is the lunar module. And let's get down all the way down there. It will take a second to load. These are data sets that are pulled. Most of them are pulled from a server. And so it does take a second. You can see, when this pulls in, you can see tracks on the moon. This is real imagery. So if you look closely, and we zoom in here, and there's a few notation. I'm not sure exactly everything here, but we have the American flag here. This is the module, and we'll zoom in here. Double tracks that you see here, those are rover tracks, and single tracks are astronaut tracks, or astronaut footpaths. And these are still visible on the moon. That's because the moon does not have the atmosphere that we have. There's hardly any erosion, and so tracks are preserved and footprints are preserved on the moon for a very long time, and perhaps for millennia. So just in terms of, and a lot of you know this, I know, but for historical perspective, and let me just turn something off here so we can see. Oh, there we go. So now we can see it a little better. Here's a little astronaut. Just to put in perspective, some of you, or if they're young people out there not realizing, why aren't we going back to the moon? Why did it take us so long? Why are we still not there? Why has it been 50 years since the last mission? And it has to do, of course, with the social, with the history that we were in. And I just want to, and I know this is very well known, but it was John F. Kennedy in 1961 who pledged $7 to $9 billion to the space program, which sounds like a lot, and even those days was a lot, but, and comparative to NASA's budget now was a tremendous amount, but that soon dwindled after Apollo 17. But he said the United States needed to take a clearly leading role in space achievement and commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. And the mission was clear: the United States must go to the moon. And space was this theater of battling the Cold War and the Russian, to beat the Russians or USSR in going to the moon. And this was really an imperative. So it was tied into a lot of the historical perspective and not just science and technology. And so here's this is a mock-up of the lander here on this map, and this is where we put the flag. And I apologize, it's a little blurry as we zoom in very close, but this is mapped out now of this Taurus-Littrow Valley of where the astronauts landed. And this was a historic mission for a lot of reasons. This was the last and longest mission, and it was the first mission. I'm going to talk a little bit about this person. There were 3 astronauts. There was, let me see, well, there was Harrison Schmitt, and there was, or Jack Schmitt. He's alive. He's a geologist. He was the first civilian and the first scientist to go to the moon. Eugene Cernan was with him on the surface. He was a commander, and there were 2 people who could go to the surface and fit in the rover. And then there was a pilot, Ron Evans, who piloted the module called America. So he did not set foot on the moon, but he was there. So there were 3 men on the moon. And there were 3 extravehicular activities, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, and I'll take you on, hopefully, not a glitchy tour. Open space can be a tiny bit, temperamental. All right, so I'm going to, oops, no, I didn't mean to do that. Hold on. And I'm going to turn off the LEM for a minute so we can see our map. This mission returned, did I make that mistake? Yes, I did. Hold on, I'm sorry. Where is okay, we want the LEM, and we want our Trav Mac back, which I turned off. There we go, that's what we want. We don't want this, and we don't want the LEM. There we go. Okay, so now here's our whole map. So let's zoom out a second and take a look at our map. So these are, of course, overlaid tracks and trails of the Taurus-Littrow Valley where the astronauts landed. And they landed here to look at volcanism on the moon. They landed here, it's surrounded by these hills, labeled massif, and we'll zoom in on several of them and talk about that. Talk about these really historical journeys that they took. And so let's go, that's just a little overview of this area. And we'll start with EVA1. And I'm going to attempt to swing this around and not take you backwards. No one likes to ride the train backwards, right? Let's see. It takes a little bit of, oopsie, a little bit of, oh. I'm not, if there are any pilots in the audience, I'm ashamed, I will say. Let's go back. I was trying to circle around, but maybe I won't take too much time taking you in the right direction, because spinning around with open space is harder probably than, well, I don't want to say it's harder than driving on the moon, but it's getting up, it's at least that experience is authentic is, you know, the challenges. But you'll see the astronauts if you've never seen them on the moon. Well, let's, so here's the LEM where the flag is, and this is EVA-1. So this trail here, they basically went to one site the first day. And that is, I'm going to get to, there are several results from this mission. They basically, for this first EVA, they went to Station 1, which is labeled here O1, and they set up the Apollo Lunar Surface Experiments package. And there were several experiments that were put here. They didn't know back then if the moon had volcanism. This was a big discovery of the mission, and another big discovery of this mission in general was the fact that not only they determined through some geology that the moon had volcanism in the past, although these craters, most of the craters you see are impact craters from meteors, essentially, not from volcanism. But the moon did have volcanism in the past, but also they found the oldest moon rock, and that dates back to about 4.2 billion years, which is older than any rock on Earth. And that's because Earth has a lot of processing and reprocessing of rocks. And so the moon does boast that oldest rock, much older than the Earth, than we have on the Earth, even though everything kind of formed around the same time, except the moon a little bit later from impact. But anyway, so this is Station 1, and Station 1 was basically the experimental package. And each of the EVAs, which are the journeys that they took on the rover, were about a little over 7 hours. And so the first EVA was they went to they set up this. They basically set up the experiments at Steno Apollo crater, which is right here. And so this is essentially just pretty close to the LEM, and they collected surface material. They collected 14 grams of samples. They set up gravity measurements. They deployed 2 explosive packages to get material from underneath, and they detonated those later remotely, so they weren't near that. But here you can see there's a topographic overlay here. All of the information I'm showing you, by the way, it is compiled in open space, and even the videos that I grabbed, but everything's public. This is taxpayer dollars at work, and so you can find these online, and you can, if you Google Apollo 17, I mean, all of these maps are available, and learning about this mission. So after they they put up in these experiments, they came back, the dotted lines are returning, and they came back to the LEM, and they stayed in there pressurized for 17 hours. Before. The first, once they landed, that was a over 22-hour day. So they had to unfold the rover, set up the rover. And one interesting thing I read is they broke the fender on the rover, and they had to makeshift so they didn't get a lot of dust as they were driving. They had to makeshift a fender, and they did that through using duct tape, of course. And rolled up, you know, we think everything's so high tech, but, you know, it's the duct tape that saves the day at the end of the day, and some stiff moon maps. And they rolled them up, and there is basically this was, let me see, oh yes, this was during EVA-2, where they ended up fixing this at this other crater, and because they fixed it, they got an improvised fender. It remained intact throughout the rest of the mission, and the president of the Auto Body Association of America awarded them an honorary lifetime membership. And that is real. That is true. Okay, so they sat here for a while, and then they got up for their second EVA, and the EVA, that is EVA-2, which is going to be orange. So let's go, yellow, rather. So let's go off to EVA-2, and this is the next day where they ended up they finally fixed their fender. And this was an interesting, they went to Nansen Crater first. So let's go out here, and we're traveling. All of these craters have been named. Some names are named after family members. There is a fun fact on some of these, which I'll get to, but let's get to Nansen Crater. I don't want to lose it. No, Crater 2, where are you? I think you're out here. Oh, there we go, Nansen Apollo. So at Nansen Crater, this is the furthest distance ever traveled away from the safety of a pressurizable spacecraft. And this is 4.7 miles, and they had to stay within a distance where they could safely walk back if the rover if the rover failed them for some reason. So that would be a 4.7-mile walk. Of course, the moon has a lot less gravity, so they could hop around. But when I show you some of the videos of Jack Schmitt in his not so eloquent walking, you might wonder how long that might take. Who knows? But they really, it's incredible. And I have to say, I go to these meetings, the Lunar and Planetary Science Conference, and Jack still goes and presents science at those conferences. Every year I've seen him. And his most packed talks, of course, are not about necessarily the science now, but about his experiences on the moon. And it's just really pretty amazing. I mean, the authenticity of seeing a person who walked on the moon and hoping really that we go back and just trying to get all the information you can. I mean, people want to hear what it was like. He shows pictures of himself on a rover. I mean, it's amazing. And really one of the most interesting kinds of talks to go to is to hear that perspective, an Apollo astronaut who walked on the moon and tell you what it's like to hook up his oxygen tubes and walk around the rover. And he's still so excited to talk about it. So that's really great. Okay, so the next station, and remember this for next time, this is labeled here Lara, but it's actually now, it's often called Ballet Crater for a reason that you'll see. And this is where Jack, and I'll show you a video of this, he fell to the ground while working. And he looked kind of awkward. That mission control, and you'll hear what they said about it, and because they're in contact with them the whole time. So they're talking to them as they're on the moon. There's only a little bit of a delay. It's not that much. The moon isn't that far. It's only 230,000 miles away. They are talking to them and joking and having conversations as they're walking on the moon. And this was renamed Ballet Crater. So you may wonder why, and you'll find out in a moment. Okay, so a lot of samples are being taken at these sites, and each site they're collecting. And remember, Jack is a geologist. He was actually not scheduled for Apollo 17. He was assigned Apollo 18, but that was scrapped, and he replaced someone. The scientific community made such a heavy case for putting him on Apollo 17 that they knew was the last mission to get a scientist on the moon, because he was the only scientist to go on the moon. Everybody else, he was a civilian. Everyone else had military background, was a pilot, an aviator. And now this really paved the way, honestly, for scientists to go to the moon. And now we have a great mix of astronauts, women, finally, right, can go to space, right? As we heard, you know, 1900s, not so long ago, and we've come a decent way. Wouldn't necessarily say all the way, but we've come a long way, where women are going to space, and we actually, I'll say that we have Artemis is happening, and we're gonna have an astronaut who's for Astronomy Days, thanks to Carrie Woke, who got our astronaut to come, who is an Artemis astronaut. She is from North Carolina. Her name is Christina Koch, and I really hope everyone comes and hears her for Astronomy Days here at the end of January. But that is how far we've come, right, in 50 years. Now we have astronauts who are going to go back, hopefully, to the moon in this decade. So this is called Shorty Crater. This is station 4. Here's where it got exciting for Jack Schmitt, especially because he found orange soil. And everyone was all excited because they didn't know if there was volcanism now on the moon, or if these craters that we see on the moon were volcanic. Because you can have cratering from volcanism, from volcanoes, with a caldera at the top that we see like in Hawaii, and you can have craters from impacts from pieces of asteroids or meteors. And the Apollo astronauts were actually trained at Meteor Crater in Arizona by geologists to help them recognize what's volcanic and what isn't. So there's tons of videos, by the way. It was hard to choose from the NASA archive of Jack. He's talking, he's so excited. There's orange soil. This was a big discovery, but it actually wasn't from the crater itself. It was from a plume that was earlier on. It wasn't, this crater was still considered an impact crater, but that was post-mission analysis from something called a fire fountain. And the moon was very active. Remember, the moon formed from an impact to Earth, and it could have had an atmosphere for a while. It could have supported life even for a while, and there certainly was molten activity on the moon, but not for a long time now, now several billion years, most likely. So these were orange volcanic beads, droplets of molten lava that were collected. And I will say, too, interestingly, as we go to Station 5, these samples were collected from Apollo 17, specifically to several of them. Pockets of samples were cached, meaning they were stored, sealed up on the moon, not to be reopened until this year, 2022. And I know some of the scientists who are working on these capsules because they specifically knew that technology would improve over the decades, and they wanted to preserve these samples and not open everything and wait for better technology so that they could be analyzed later. And now people are doing that. There was a whole application process of people applying to work on these samples, and now they're being analyzed again with newer technology. So so a lot of the samples collected during this mission were for that purpose specifically. And by the way, over 400 pounds of rocks were taken back. And this is why they left the rovers, they left cameras on the moon, a lot of cameras, Hasselblad, really nice cameras, left on the moon. Worth it to go just to get those cameras back. But understandably, you want to jettison as much as you can because you want to take as many rocks back as you can. And so Camelot, this is station 5. This is where 75 pounds of samples were taken at this crater here. And they completed the longest duration EVA in history to date, traveling farther away at Camelot. They traveled as far, they covered as much ground, more ground than any other astronaut in this total EVA, this activity this day on EVA 2. And I'll just read something I found that I thought was cool at Camelot Crater. So this is journal notes. There's a whole journal for Apollo 17, the Apollo 17 journal. And you can read, and it's archived really well. NASA, if you even Googled like Apollo 17 journal, you can get these videos and actual, with audio and journal notes. So I'll just read this quick note. Jack is standing in an interesting boulder field beside a 2-meter-high boulder with others scattered thickly about him on the ground. He tosses a jocular remark to the television camera like a performer. Here I am, folks, in the middle of a boulder field, just minding my own business. He reverts immediately to the role of scientist, treating us to some arcane jargon as he hops amongst the rocks. The mineral texture appears to be subophytic. Don't ask me what that is. Like a good diabase. These are just minerals that he's talking about, although a little coarser, organized with that variation in vesicle concentration. So he goes from scientist, but he does joke around a lot, which is fun. Okay, so that was it for EVA2, and they come back, and here they go, and they're going to stay a while in their nice little pressurized cabin. And then the third EVA, this is the last EVA ever for humans on the moon. And yes, we are going back. We haven't yet done it. And so 50 years later, we're still hopeful that we'll get there. So the last EVA, December 13th at 5:25 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So you can think about that whenever that day comes. I don't even know what date it is. What's today? I don't know. Today's 9th, I think. But anyway, so a couple days from now. So here we go, EVA3, this is North Massif, so this is a hill, and there's a really interesting boulder here, so we're going to get there. And we're driving our rover here, and they're driving. They went about 4 miles, actually I think it was 11 miles an hour at fastest, which is pretty fast to be honest, in a rover on the moon, I think. But if you take a look here, we're going to stop here at this boulder. Now this you see this trail here coming down the hill, that, can you even, oh yeah, there, good. That is the track of this boulder that rolled down the hill in North Massif. And something happening. Okay. There's a little static. I don't know what's going on. Yeah? Ugh. Okay. We're going to stop. So what they did, what Jack did, and you'll see a little bit of this. I did choose some videos around this area. So to see this, he took very high-resolution pictures. They had cameras strapped to them. They took video. They had their Hasselblad cameras. And they took these really high-resolution images. And with a technique called photogrammetry, they were able to put these in three-dimensional models, or not even models. These are the images in OpenSpace. And so we have these. They're a little bit, with the next version of OpenSpace, this is still a little bit in beta. We're going to have a better looking base here. But this is the real rock in the real location. And you can zoom in and see some excellent detail. And there's some, this is like a basaltic rock. And you can see the, I've heard a friend of mine who knows a lot of geology. He's a curator of meteorites at American Museum of Natural History. He could talk for half an hour just about the geology of this rock. But it's pretty amazing. And then you'll see how in these videos they collected the samples. They had little kind of these sticks, and they pulled these samples from the rock and collected a whole bunch. And you can you can travel around in open space. What I'm trying to find is, and I hope I get the right spot. I do get sometimes. There are, maybe it's in the other. Oh no, there it is. Those are the footprints. So you can see his footprints right here. You get a little bit of it right here. There you go. Those are the footprints. 2 footprints right there on the bottom where my cursor is. And so you can travel around this boulder, and this was actually, it's called Split Rock, they named it, or Tracy's Rock, depending on, Gene Cernan named it after his daughter, and it's also called Split Rock, and they collected a whole bunch of samples from this rock. And they, and from this EVA, and I don't know exactly which station it was, but from this EVA, they selected the Goodwill rocks. And this is a sample of a rock that was, every state got one. We have one right outside the astronomy lab in the Nature Research Center on the 3rd floor, right outside our lab, and it comes with a flag. Every state's flag flew into the space too on this mission. They were given the rock and as a gift from Richard Nixon's administration, and the flag with a plaque, and you can read that, and it's on display here. And the Goodwill rocks were really meant, you know, there was a whole entry by Gene Cernan writing about the Goodwill rocks, how when they found them, they looked like a conglomeration of all these different rocks with different colors and textures, just kind of, he said, living peacefully together. And they selected this bunch of rocks to represent kind of this coming together of humanity. And how, and really if you watch documentaries on Apollo in general, like there's a great documentary called Apollo 11. If you haven't seen it, that was during the anniversary of Apollo 11 a few years ago, there was this wonderful documentary just really showing us all archival footage, just showing this kind of spirit of America coming together to make Apollo happen. And no one knew how it was basically set to go by Kennedy without even a way to do it. We didn't have a way to do it. And the Saturn V was then made, and then all of these other really amazing missions came after Apollo 11. Now we had rovers on the moon and all of this stuff. I mean, but a truly remarkable mission of Apollo 11 isn't, you know, we should remember that. And then there's several stages. Station 7, there's other craters, and then we're coming around here to Station 8 and 9, and these are just basically other craters that they sampled. I should check my time a little bit and drop my notes, which is good. Okay, excuse me. Okay, so, So there's a lot of astronauts tend to, you know, you start to get a perspective. Many of you probably know, as astronauts look out the windows of the most profound experience for a lot of astronauts, and this has been well documented, is seeing the Earth in a new perspective. And there was a very famous picture taken of the Earth called the Blue Marble, which was taken on this mission. Jack says he took it. It's not quite, people aren't quite sure who took it, but it could have been him, where it's basically inspired Earth Day, inspired taking care of this planet better, I guess you could say. And there's been just seeing the Earth as a whole, sitting in the vastness and blackness of space, that really changes people's perspective. We lose that here as small beings in a city or anywhere really on this planet. We don't see this perspective, and only a very small handful of these fortunate, I think, humans got to do this and see this. And I'll just read a second here. This was a remark by Gene Cernan, who says, "I'm on the surface, and as I take man's last step from the surface, back home for some time to come, but we believe not too long into the future, I'd like to just say what I believe history will record, that America's challenge of today has forged man's destiny of tomorrow. And as we leave the moon at Taurus Littrow, we leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return, with peace and hope for all mankind. Godspeed, the crew of Apollo 17. And just as a footnote to that, none of these astronauts went to space again. Cernan retired from NASA, and he died in 2017. Evans retired from the Navy in 1976. And from NASA in 1977, he entered the private sector and died in 1990. And Jack Schmitt, as I said, he's still alive. He became a senator from New Mexico and served 6 years. And they're really remarkable, I think. This was a remarkable time to have this kind of adventure, and I really hope we go back. And so I'll just, in there, and I'll ask it for you to put the slides up. And these are going to be, and I have a little controller, these are going to be some videos that I chose from the archive just to see, just to end this. And so first, well, the first one isn't a video. And so these are the astronauts, if you haven't seen them. Jack Schmitt is on the left. Gene Cernan is in the middle, I hope. I think someone will correct me, but I believe that's Gene Cernan. And then Evans is on the right, the pilot. Okay, so. He was singing this while he did. So you know, I mean, they're regular guys, right? And they look like they're having the best time. And who wouldn't, honestly? Okay, so next, this is at Ballet Crater. I want to turn the sound up a little. It's not easy. He's wearing this big puffy suit. He said, would you go help Twinkle Toes? That's Mission Control Bob Parker. Well, anyway, it goes on for a little bit, but it's all right. I'll go to the next one. He's trying to clean his lens. So this is collecting samples. He took his visor up so you can see his face, actually. You can see his face really clearly, which is interesting.
Well, I'll set it right up here. It's going to fall down the hill. You better stomp off a good place. Yeah.
Okay. And here's some more rock sampling. I think you have to turn it up a little bit, the sound. Thanks. All right. Well, let's just give you an idea. They started talking top.
The Valley of History has seen mankind complete its first evolutionary steps into the universe, leaving the planet Earth and going forward into the universe. I think no more significant contribution has Apollo made to history. It's not often that you can foretell history, but I think we can in this case.
So that's their thoughts, like I was reading. And the final one is the launch up, which is the last time we ever left the moon.
48 foot into our destiny on the gift probe. 99 proceeded, 3, 2, 1. Ignition. Fire away, Houston. Vector good. Ag 5. Hit the order. Okay, you have to back.
I mean, it's, so, and I put up, this is the link, this is my last slide. This is the link to the journal. You can take a picture of it or write it down. But I hope, I mean, to me, these are so motivating. I could watch these all day, and there's so many. And how we documented it, we filmed it, they were in communication. I mean, this is a journey we should, I think, do again and keep going to, explore. So thank you. If you have any questions, I'll take your questions. Thank you.
Let's give Dr. Smith a round of applause.
Thank you.
If you do have a question, wave at me. I want to bring you a microphone. That way everyone in the room and on the live stream can hear. So if we've got any, just wiggle your fingers.
Does NASA have any plans to revisit any of these sites?
Yeah, I think so. That's a good question about the revisiting these sites. Exactly when and where, I'm not sure, but there was a discussion about revisiting where the experiments are. I mean, so I think there's a debate. You don't want to go back to the same one necessarily since we've been there, but there is discussion about revisiting some of those experimental sites. So, but exactly the landing of Artemis, I'm not 100% sure if they've finalized that. That's a good question.
But shouldn't these landing sites should be like maybe preserved?
Preserve the landing sites? Yeah, like how would you, what do you mean?
I mean, like for the future, maybe it will be like very interesting, like just to visit them, just to see and untouch it.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. So it's like kind of a marker. And they do have plaques there. So there are plaques on the moon, but that opens up a whole discussion about space as a real new frontier and visits and regular visits, and opens up this whole discussion about ownership, land, and laws and everything that's not at all determined. And so that's a really good point. I mean, nobody owns the moon. We plant flags, but someone could pick up your flag. And so that's a whole really interesting and absolutely important discussion that I know is happening with their space laws that are sort of there, space, who has jurisdiction, all of these questions, and then preservation of sites is really interesting, but that people tend to want to go in any case, and so determining if you can kind of cordon off, but I would imagine, I mean, just if there's the first landing, if there are plaques there, those will probably be able to be preserved, but then it's sort of, there has to be an international decision for that. Because right now, we don't own these sites. We just put a plaque down. It's kind of like Antarctica, I guess, is that you could say you were there. But it's a really, I think this is absolutely the edge of where we have to go in terms of deciding who goes where, when we go, how we go, preserving just also the natural state, which, we're not so great at doing here on Earth. So. There's a question of the little person. Oh, okay.
Thank you for the walkthrough. It was great.
Thanks.
Apollo 17, why did they choose this particular location or these locations to visit?
Yeah, my understanding is they chose the Taurus Littrow Valley because it could have had volcanism, and they wanted to determine if there was volcanism in the moon. So a lot of it was questions about volcanism and to determine if that activity had been happening on the moon. And so this was a safe place to land too. It was a lit area. It was a nice flat valley with a lot of craters and surrounded by these hills. And so it was selected for the science and also the ease of landing there and not repeating, the same landing site either. They could drive, they thought.
Are we ever gonna go to like different planets than the moon and Mars?
Yeah, that's a great question. Are we ever gonna go? I certainly hope so. We have to get here first again, and Mars would be next, but it's really hard because they're really far away, and that's the basic answer. It takes 3 days to get to the moon with a rocket. Using that same rocket would take 8 months to a year to get to Mars, and then you can't come back for 2 years. So they have to figure out how to make that happen, and so it's very hard because space is just so big. And hopefully one day, I hope so. We gotta keep going. Maybe you'll go one day to Mars.
So the moon, it's really for exploration. Well, we might have Russia, China in it, all that kind of thing. But from what they can tell, is there a high mineral content there? I mean, is that what, it's going to be a mining, not only an educational place, but
Right.
for mining?
I don't think the moon, so I think asteroids are more of interest for mining, but as far as rare elements, I don't think that's the interest for the moon. It's more to set up a base. So NASA is not going next to the moon just to visit and come back. They want to set up a base so that's the launching point for Mars. So really it's to set up a permanent area, just like we have the International Space Station up in, not so far from Earth, we'll have a base on the moon. And so that's the goal. And it's mostly, we know there's water on the moon. There's water in terms of in ice form. So we want to be able to extract that for energy and for water to drink and for astronauts to live there for a longer time. So that's the goal, is longer term habitation eventually. And honestly, if we ever decide, thinking very long term, I teach astrobiology and I think about this a lot, is if we ever want to think about humanity as a whole getting off this planet, we have to do this. You can't not do this and then just suddenly jump to another star system. We have to develop the technology to live in space, to however our bodies withstand that, to then eventually go to Mars. And then but that's like going next door. Mars is like the next block over in terms of a universal scale. I mean, we want to go, if we want to become a spacefaring species and eventually be able to inhabit other planets, we've got a long way to go, and this is the first step to do it.
All right, last one in this segment.
The boulder that rolled down the hill.
Yeah.
Why did it do that? There's no water, there's no wind, there's nothing to push
Gravity. There is some gravity on the moon, and
but what got it over that hump,
Over
so
the-
to speak, of starting?
well, it could have been an impact. I mean, that would be my first guess. I don't know if we know why it rolled down the hill, but my hunch is that something, either it was slowly gravity will pull it, that could have happened, and there could have been some impacts to jostle it out of this equilibrium state that it was in. I mean, it's slower, but it wouldn't be wind or anything like that. It would have to be impact generated, which probably could have something to do with it, or just gravity slowly over time pulling it down.
Let's give Dr. Smith one more
Thank you,
round of
everyone. And
applause.
please do if you want. And I think online, if you're online, do your QR code. And if you're online, there's a link that I think was shared. So thank you so much. And then we'll move on to my colleague, Dr. Patrick Treuthardt. So,
How are we doing so far, everybody? Having a great time? Excellent stuff. I know we're learning a lot. We're thinking about a lot of great things, and we've had now 2 fabulous presentations. Roll into our third guest speaker for the night, who happens to also work with us here at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. He's the assistant head of the Astronomy and Astrophysics Research Lab, Dr. Patrick Treuthardt. Sorry, I didn't know I needed to queue up more space jokes before needed to stall for Patrick to get set up. I don't have anything.
Oh, astronomy days. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That's perfect. You must be a museum member because you're helping me out up here. January 28th and 29th, the museum will celebrate Astronomy Days, a Saturday and Sunday devoted to all things space, astronomy, astrophysics here inside the museum, and probably a few things out on the Bicentennial Plaza as well. Here in this theater and the other presentation spaces that we have here in the museum, guest speakers from all over will be coming up on stage and sharing their science, but even more fun maybe than sitting and listening to the guest experts is going to be being out in the museum, where we'll have exhibitors from local astronomy clubs. We'll have telescopes set up. There will be anything and everything related to space that you could possibly want to learn about happening here, including a very special guest. I don't even know which exact special guest it's going to be, but a NASA astronaut will be here on the stage. It will be, oh, fantastic. NASA astronaut Christina Cook is going to be here on stage, who did her degrees at North Carolina State University and lived in North Carolina until moving to Houston to be an astronaut. How exciting. But Christina will be here on the stage talking about her work. I think she's an Artemis astronaut, was on the ISS, and holds the record for the longest space flight, or the longest record for a woman on the International Space Station. So, all that said, we're going to be having a great time. You can also just come and do crafts, play games, activities. All of that stuff is going to be going on. Plus, we're just a great museum to spend a weekend at. Thanks for the help, everybody.
All right. Can everybody hear me okay? Yep, okay. So my computer crashed as I was coming up here. So I am now, it's been rebooted. Presentation is recovering. Let's see if this pairs up correctly. Let me do one thing here. Yeah, well, we could just do this.
Wow, is that what a slideshow presentation looks like for an astrophysicist? Patrick, did you code your entire slideshow?
No, yeah. This is Linux, everybody. Yeah. Apparently everybody hates it but me. All right. Well, we'll just do it this way. Okay. Didn't actually want to mirror it, but all right, we'll just do this. Okay. So, hello everyone. My name is Patrick Treuthardt. I am one of the astronomers here at the museum. So, like Rachel, I don't study the moon. I actually study galaxies outside of our own galaxy. But what I do know about the moon is just some of the things that kind of more or less interest me about the moon. And so, what we're going to do is we're just going to talk about some of the things that are very easy to see at the moon regarding the moon, and then some of the questions that scientists and basically I have about the moon myself, just some of the more broad kind of fundamental questions about the moon itself, which I find to be pretty interesting. Okay, so I titled this talk, Our Neighbor the Moon, and I mean, it's true, the moon is the closest celestial body to us, right? But how close actually is it? And so the best way to kind of visualize, in my opinion, how close the moon actually is to us is by thinking of it in terms of the speed of light. So obviously, the light moves incredibly fast. So this animation made by James O'Donoghue, which he makes great animations, he basically made a scale model of the Earth, and then put in the speed of light to kind of show you, put in a beam of light to show you how fast light actually moves around the Earth. So a beam of light will basically lap the Earth 7.5 times per second. So it moves incredibly fast. But when you put it, basically if you have a beam of light traveling from the Earth to the moon and back, the distance between the Earth and the moon actually is very, very large. Even though it's the closest natural body to the Earth, the distance between the Earth and the moon is actually very, very large. And it's so large that the time delay from a beam of light or radio signal leaving the Earth, bouncing off the moon, and coming back to the Earth is measurable. And it's about 2.5 seconds or 3 seconds. And so this animation actually shows you a scale model of the Earth, the moon, a scale distance, and then the scale light travel time of a beam of light traveling from the Earth to the moon. So the distance between the Earth and the moon actually is large enough for there to be a time delay for instance, a radio signal for talking to astronauts. Okay, so the everyday moon. So when you go out during the day or at night or at dusk and you see the moon, what are some of the things that you actually notice? What are some of the things that you notice every day about the moon? So one of the cool things that you may notice is when you have a full moon right on the horizon, what do you actually see? What happens to the moon when it's yeah, it looks like it's very, very large, right? But now, is that true? Is the moon very, very large when it's close to the horizon and different when it's high up in the sky? No. Okay. So a lot of people know this already. Yeah. So that's actually known as moon illusion. And so, for some reason, and it's actually not clear how this works, but it's been recorded for a very long time. When the moon is close to the horizon, for some reason, it looks like the moon is very, very large compared to when it's higher up in the sky. But the fact is that the moon's size actually does not change when it's close to the horizon or higher up in the sky. It's just some weird trick in your brain that causes that illusion to happen. And the strange thing is, a lot of people think it's because perhaps the moon is close to objects that you're familiar with, so like trees, mountains, things like that. So now you have a frame of reference. But astronauts in space actually notice that moon illusion as well. And so they don't really have that same frame of reference. So it's weird that it happens. And there's not a really good explanation for it yet. But one way that you can actually measure this for yourself is either by taking a photo of the moon, or you can just go out and look at the moon yourself. And so if you take your hand and extend it out as far as it'll go, and extend your pinky and close one eye, your tiny little finger, will actually take up 1 degree in your field of view. So if you look at me and close one eye and put your pinky over my head, basically my head is taking maybe a degree or less in your field of view. So you can actually measure what's known as angular size by doing that. So the moon takes up about 1/2 degree in your field of view. So you can actually do this and cover up the moon with your pinky when you do this. And so if you do this, both when the moon is on the horizon and when the moon is high up in the sky, you'll see that you're able to cover it up both times. So you can actually measure the size of the moon yourself. Okay, so when we look at the moon, so this is actually a blown up version of the moon, obviously. But when you look at the moon, when you, for instance, look at the full moon, what are some of the things that you see? So a lot of people put images to all the structures that you see on the moon. So what is a structure what is an image that most people see when they look at the moon? The man in the moon, right? Yeah, so a lot of people seem to see a face in the moon, right? And so that's basically these dark splotches seem to make what looks like a face. So there's also another interesting one that I never really see, but there's the lady in the moon. So you can see her hair, her mouth, you can see an eye there. And then there's one other one that's actually pretty interesting that basically is, I guess, more known in China or Asia. Does anybody know what that one is? Did somebody say it? Nobody said it? Okay, so this one, let me warn you, this one you will never unsee. Okay, personally, this is all I see now that I know about it. So if you don't want to know this, I would close your eyes because you'll only see this from now on. And that's the rabbit in the moon. And so basically it takes up all the dark structures that you see on the moon, but it does create what really looks like a rabbit. So you got the ears, you got the head, you got the feet. So if you go back now, do you see the man in the moon or do you see a rabbit in the moon now, right? Yeah, so you'll forever see the rabbit in the moon. Okay, and so this is less of an everyday thing, but this is more monthly. And there's a lot going on in this video, but if you just pay attention to the moon in the center, so what are some of the things that you see going on here? I mean, obviously it's labeled too, but What are some of the weird things that you see going on? Wobbles. Yes, it wobbles. And that's known as libration. And that wobbling, so this video is taking, basically these are photos of the moon taken each hour over a period of a year in 2021. And so they're all stitched together, creating this, basically this animation that you're seeing here. And yeah, so you're seeing this wobble. And this wobble is due to a lot of things. So the Earth's axis is actually tilted 23.5 degrees relative to its orbital plane around the sun. The moon's orbital plane is about 5 degrees to the Earth's orbital plane. Its axis to that orbital plane is off by about 1 degree. And so a combination of all those things and the Earth, the moon orbiting around the Earth orbiting around the sun, things like that, and the moon's distance from the Earth also changes because it's not a perfectly circular orbit. It's actually an elliptical orbit. So that's how you get it looking slightly bigger and smaller. The tilting, the wobbling back and forth, that's all due to essentially the difference in axes and orbits and things like that of the moon around the Earth. But yeah, so you got that wobble. Obviously, there are the phases that you're seeing here. So you're seeing a shadow being cast across the moon. And so the phases are due to the position of the moon relative to the sun where you're standing on the Earth, okay? So basically, if the sun and the moon are in the same direction, then you get the new moon, so you're seeing the shadow of the moon, essentially. You're seeing the unlit side of the moon as you look up at the moon. When the Earth is on the same side as the sun and the moon is on the opposite side, that's when you get a full moon. So that's when you see the entire face of the moon lit up. But what also do you notice about the face of the moon? We never see the other side. Yes, right. You never see the other side of the moon, right? So you're always seeing the same rabbit in the moon, right? You're never going to see the other side of the moon. So the wobble, that libration, you actually do see a little bit of the edge, so it does kind of shake back and forth a little bit, so you can see a little bit more than 50% of the moon. But essentially, the same face of the moon is facing us all the time. And that's because over a period of time, the moon became what's known as tidally locked with the Earth. So its rotation period and its orbital period are the same. So it's basically about a month, right? So it takes about a month for it to rotate on its axis, and it takes about a month for it to orbit around the Earth. And those times are synced, so that way the same face is facing us all the time. Was that always the case? Likely not, but over a period of time, that actually locked up. Yeah, I mean, it basically locked up over a period of time, so there's a tidal drag between the Earth and the moon, and which actually slowed down the Earth's rotation a little bit too, but it also really slowed down the moon's rotation and locked it up like that. So there are other moons in the solar system that are tidally locked with their host planets as well. Our moon is just the one we notice more easily. Say that again? Why is the moon drifting away? It's basically because of that tidal force as well. So there's some physics going on that essentially, as that tidal locking happens, it's slowing down the Earth, but it's also causing the moon to drift away by conserving that energy. So basically, the moon slowly drifts away. I think it's about an inch a year from the Earth. And eventually, it'll get so far away from the Earth that the Earth's gravity won't really hold on to it anymore, and it'll basically just drift off into space. All right, so if we look at the moon in a little more detail, we can see some of the other interesting features about it. So this is from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. So they did really detailed maps of the moon, but they also did entire maps of the moon. So not just the front, but also the back, the part that we can't see. But you can see the side that we see, the rabbit in the moon that we see, it's all these dark splotches on the near side of the moon, the side that faces us. But when you look at the far side, you don't really see that much stuff. I mean, you see a lot of impact craters. You can see, oops, is the mouse pointer going to show up? You can see like a crater here with all these rays coming out of it. But a lot of these dark splotches don't show up as much on the far side of the moon as they do on the near side, which is strange. So again, here's just a static image of the near side of the moon. There's the rabbit in the moon. And so the dark splotches are what's known as the Maria. So that is Latin for seas. So initially, when people started looking up at the moon, they thought that those dark splotches on the moon were actually oceans on the moon, but now we know that they're not. So the dark splotches, each dark splotch is known as a mare. They're collectively known as the Maria. On all the lighter regions on the moon, so for instance in this lower region here that's circled in red, all these light cratered regions out here, these lighter colored cratered regions out here, these are known as the highlands. So essentially the moon is composed of mare and highlands. And the mare are much younger relative to the highlands. The highlands are highly cratered areas, and the mare are relatively smooth and uncratered. Okay, so if you go out and you look at the full moon or some phase of the moon, you're going to see. I mean, I'm just picking out some interesting places here. But you can see Mare Tranquillitatis, which is the Sea of Tranquility, which is what? What's that famous for? Apollo 11. Yeah. So the first moon landing was in the Sea of Tranquility, and the Apollo 17 mission was in the Sea of Serenity. So you can actually see those two mare basically with your naked eye when you look up at the moon. The other interesting features, so there's a crater over here called Copernicus crater that you can fairly easily see, if not with your naked eye, definitely with binoculars. And then there's also another interesting crater down here called Tycho crater. And this one is really, really interesting and really obvious. So it's it's a relatively young crater. It's estimated to be, I think, about 180 million years old. And you can see these white rays basically stretching all the way across the moon coming from this crater. So essentially what happened was the moon was impacted, and it's threw moon dust up into the, up over the moon, and it rained back down on the moon in these striations. And so some of these striations actually fell near the Apollo 17 landing, near where Apollo 17, the mission was taking place. And they actually collected some of these moon rocks from there and were able to date it to about 180 million years based on the debris that was cast that far away. Okay, so again, this is the far side. So obviously this is not going to look familiar to you at all. And really, there's not much to talk about here. You can see that there's a little bit of mare down here. You can see there's some mare over here. There's a depression that looks a little bit darker over here. This is known as the Southern Basin, the South Atkin Basin. But within that, there's actually something interesting going on right now. So this location here is called the Von Karman crater. And does anybody know what's going on there right now? Nobody? Okay. So at the Von Karman crater, there's actually a lunar rover driving around since 2019. So the Chinese did the first soft landing on the far side of the moon in 2019 and deployed a lunar rover that's been driving around since that time, since early January 2019. And so far it's driven, I think, about 1 kilometer within that crater. And so here you can see, barely, but this is a photograph that was released in early 2022. And you can see the tracks. Here we go. So you can see the tracks from the lunar rover. And it's just taking kind of a circuitous path. And then over here, obviously where the yellow arrow is, that's the lander that deployed the rover. And so it's actually found some interesting things. It's found glass beads, which they think is from impacts. And they also think that they found a rock from the actual mantle of the moon. So not just the crust of the moon, but the actual part of what was further in the interior of the moon, which is pretty interesting as well. Okay, so this is the north pole of the moon. And again, it's not that fascinating. It's not that, obviously it's not going to look that familiar. You can see a lot of cratering over here. You can see some obvious craters. I don't know if you can see my arrow too well, but you can see a crater with a central peak there and here. So essentially, these are craters where the impact was such that when the meteoroid struck the moon, it basically caused a rebound. So if you ever watch like slow motion videos of a droplet of water falling into a pool of water, you see like basically a crater being formed and then the droplet kind of rebounding back through the center. That's essentially what happens in these craters. You have that rebound, and that ends up being frozen, and you end up with that central peak within those craters. And so you can see down here, the bottom of the image, you can see the mare on the near side of the moon, and you can see that they're not really cratered, right? You can see that essentially you have craters, but they seem to be filled in by this mare. And so we'll talk more about that in a minute. Okay, so what's more interesting is the south pole of the moon. So again, this is a LRO image of the south pole of the moon, and you can see a lot of it is very dark. Okay, and this is actually very interesting. And so what I want you to pay attention to, are these two spots here. So one is this crater that's essentially right at the vertex, right exactly at the south pole. This is called Shackleton crater. And then this other spot here is called L cross. And so what's interesting about these areas, essentially the south pole of the moon, is that some of these craters get absolutely no sunlight whatsoever. So this is the average illumination over a lunar day, so essentially a month. And you can see some of these craters are completely black. So here's where L cross is. This is Shackleton crater. And you can see these regions are completely dark. So these regions get absolutely no sunlight whatsoever. So this is actually really interesting because not only do they get no sunlight, but they're also extremely cold. And so it's thought, or there was a lot of thought put into this, that these regions, because they're so cold, they never see sunlight, that there could be remnants of water ice in these craters. And so what's important about that, so there was a lot of thought put into that. They sent, I think there was a satellite that they sent over some of these regions that did a radar reflectivity, and they did get reflective bounces that indicated some water ice. And then L cross in 2019 was a satellite that they crashed into the moon, into that region, into one of those shadowed regions, so essentially right about here, in order to kick up some of that material so that way they could analyze it to see what it was composed of. And they did find water ice from that impact. So Shackleton crater here at the South Pole, this is now very important because now in 2025, when Artemis 3 lands the first people on the moon since Apollo 17, they want to land people near that crater. So somewhere in this region, I don't think it's been completely determined yet, but somewhere in the South Pole region, they want to land people in order to actually dig for some of this ice to see if it's actually there. And the reason why they want this, the reason why it's so important, is because obviously we need water to drink, right? So if we don't have to bring water with us, if we can just use the water that's there, that saves a ton of money, right? And it saves a lot of weight. It's just more stuff we don't have to bring with us, right? We can just mine it there. But the other thing is that water could also be separated into hydrogen and oxygen, and the hydrogen can be used as fuel. And so that's important too. And also you can use the oxygen to breathe. So having a supply of water at the moon that potentially could be mined is actually really, really helpful. And so that's one of the goals, I think, of Artemis 3, is to actually look for this and see if it's sustainable. Okay, so I'm actually running through this pretty fast. So what are some of the questions about the moon that scientists have or that I find to be pretty interesting? So one is actually about the evolution of the moon. So this is a video made by NASA that kind of shows how we think the moon evolved. And so I'll kind of narrate it as it happens, but there's also text that pops up. So at some point the moon formed. This happened about 4.5 billion years ago. So it formed, it started cooling, you started getting a crust, and then at some point afterwards, there's a period known as heavy bombardment. And so it's a short period of time early in the history of the solar system where there were a tremendous amount of large impacts throughout the solar system, but that are basically recorded on the moon. So this first impact that you're seeing here, this is creation of that South Acton Basin. But now you see this period of heavy bombardment. So these are very large impacts that essentially create these basins that the mare are in. And so you have this period of just very large impacts all over the moon and also all over the solar system, the Earth included. And then shortly after the period of heavy bombardment ends, Then lava or magma seeps up through the moon, through the surface of the moon, and then fills in these basins and creates these dark lava fields that you see on our side of the moon, on the near side of the moon. So it wasn't the impacts that created, the impacts created the basins, but they didn't force the lava to the surface. It was some short time thereafter that lava actually seeped into these basins and filled them in. And basically all those large impacts that you saw are basically filled in, which makes them look very, very smooth. And then basically from that point till now you have the period of intermediate cratering where you just get small impacts that kind of trickle out because debris the solar system kind of clears itself of debris, more or less. And so the impacting kind of dies out. I mean, it's not gone, but it just isn't as frequent as it was earlier in the solar system. And then you end up with, the moon that we see today. So, so this is how we think the moon evolved from its formation until now. Now, this period of heavy bombardment, while it seems to be like the common theory, the common explanation as to what's going on, there are some caveats to that. So the period of heavy bombardment was based on moon rocks that were collected by the Apollo missions. And some of the thoughts are that perhaps, and so this period of heavy bombardment is contained within a relatively small period of time based on the moon rocks that were analyzed. And so there's some ideas that perhaps the sampling wasn't entirely random of these moon rocks, that the moon rocks that were collected were essentially all from the same impact, that strew debris all over the surface, and the surface rocks that the astronauts picked up were the ones that were analyzed. So it may not have been completely random. And also, it could also be that maybe there was a period of heavy bombardment, but it didn't just start after the Atkin Basin formed. It happened before then as well. But the impacts, the cratering was so frequent that it basically pulverized like any record of it. So all the moon rocks that are left from those impacts are essentially so small that you just wouldn't pick them up or wouldn't really notice them. So those are some ideas as to why all of a sudden we have this period of heavy bombardment. But that is to say also that simulations have also been done as to how to explain this short period of heavy bombardment as well. And it's thought that perhaps Jupiter was actually closer to the Earth, sorry, not closer to the Earth, closer to the sun, and migrated outwards in its orbit around the sun. And as it did that, it kind of, because it has so much gravity, it kind of disturbed things in the solar system and caused what was once stable orbits of large asteroids or meteoroids to basically be disturbed and then fall toward the sun and then become impactors on the moon as well. So simulations do show that can happen as well. So even though heavy bombardment is what people talk about mostly, it's not, I would say it's not 100%, but it is a really good explanation. Okay, so obviously we've all noticed this now. Why are the mare only on the near side? So this is this is basically an unraveling of the moon. So the near side is right dead in the center, and the far side is obviously at the edges, at both edges. So if you take both sides and you fold them together, then you get the full moon. So why is it that the mare only seem to be on the near side? And so that's actually a very interesting question that doesn't have a really good answer yet. So when we look at basically the elevation of the moon, when we look at the relative thickness of the crust of the moon, we can see that in general, the moon is much thinner on the near side than it is on the far side. So you can see here, like this red is a really high elevation, the yellow is pretty high. But here, everything is pretty leveled out, and it's pretty low. But that is to say, this Atkin Basin down here, this is actually, some of these regions are actually much lower than regions on the near side. But these are not filled in by mare lava. So it's interesting. So the question is why is the mare only on this side, and why isn't it, as commonly found over here? So one hypothesis was that early in the moon's formation, basically when it solidified, there was perhaps a very gentle glancing impact by some loosely bound object that basically deposited material on the far side, which created this yellow region that you see here. But there's not a lot of evidence for that, and I think there's some evidence against that as well. So that's likely not the reason. I think the best explanation I've heard is that essentially as the moon was cooling, the Earth was also very, very hot at that point too. And it was actually emitting so much radiation that the near side of the moon was actually heated up, which actually caused the near side to be slightly thinner, so when the radioactivity within the moon caused the lava to basically escape through the surface, it escaped through the thinner parts, which would be on the near side facing the Earth, which may or may not be true, but sounds pretty good to me. Okay, and so one other interesting thing is looking at the moon relative to other moons in the solar system. So obviously we have the Earth there for a scale. We have the Earth's moon. Mercury and Venus do not have moons. Mars has 2 moons, but they're really just captured asteroids. And then the Jovian planets, so the gas giants in our solar system, they all have moons. And these are just some of the larger moons for each of the gas giants. We also have Pluto, and we also have Eris, but those are dwarf planets. So let's just ignore those as well. But so it's interesting that of all the terrestrial planets, the Earth has a moon, right? So Mars technically has moons, but let's say no. But Mercury and Venus don't have moons. And the weird thing too is that Venus is very much like Earth in that it's about the same size, the same mass, but it doesn't have a moon itself. So why does the Earth have a moon? And also, why is the Earth's moon so large relative to the Earth? So when we look at some of these other moons, so especially like Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, the largest moons that orbit these planets are only about 4% the size of the planet they orbit, whereas the Earth's moon is about 1/4 the size of the Earth. So why is the Earth's moon so large? Why do we have a moon? And why is the Earth's moon so large relative to the planet it orbits around? And so that's an interesting question. And so, I mean, there are lots of other things, like technical things that people who actually study the moon are interested in. But one thing that I just pulled out is also basically if we look at isotope ratios in the Earth and the moon, when we look at specific isotope ratios, they're actually identical in both the Earth and the moon, which is unexpected. And so there are other weird things between the Earth and the moon as well, but these are 2 of the things that I find to be most interesting. So what can actually explain this? Why does the Earth have a moon? Why is it so large? Why is essentially the isotope ratio of the Earth and the moon the same, whereas like other moons and other planets, it's not? And so the prevailing theory as to why this is, or the best explanation to wrap all of these different things together, is that what caused the moon to form was actually a very catastrophic event, a very cataclysmic event with the proto-Earth. So when the Earth was very, very young and basically still molten, it's thought that a giant Mars-sized object hit the Earth at a glancing blow and basically threw out a bunch of material from the Earth, a bunch of like crust and mantle from the Earth into space, and then that material essentially coalesced and solidified and became the moon. And so this is known as the giant impact hypothesis. And so doing this, so this object that crashed into the moon is known as Theia. So by making Theia essentially whatever material you want and having this impact happen, you basically get out explanations for all of these mysteries, right? But the problem was the dynamics of it, right? So like physically, how could this happen, and how could you have this molten blob essentially be at the right orbit around Earth? How can you capture this blob in orbit around the Earth afterwards? And so it took a little while, but some astronomers actually managed to create computer simulations that actually recreate this dynamical situation in the proper amount of time for it to form and cool and basically form this moon-sized object. And so this is one of these more recent simulations showing this. All right, and so finally, one of the questions that, that is actually being worked on now as well is essentially how often is meteoroids? And so that's actually really interesting for a number of reasons. So obviously the moon isn't being struck by very large objects frequently, right? Because we're not seeing giant craters. Like you're not going out, you know, one afternoon or one night looking at the full moon and saying, oh, there's a whole new giant crater on the moon in the mare, right? So these giant impacts aren't happening now, but there are small impacts on the moon. And how frequent are these small impacts? And essentially, you know, what is the size range of the larger ones? So the reason why we want to know this is essentially for basically for our own benefit, right? So obviously we want to send people to the moon. We want to create like a permanent base on the moon. And essentially, if we want to expand that base and make that base larger, it becomes a larger target for potential meteoroid strikes, right? And so if that's the case, we need to know how often these strikes happen, and then if that's the case, how do we mitigate these strikes? There's also potentially spacecraft in orbit. If we have a lot of spacecraft in orbit around the moon, they could potentially be struck by meteoroids as well. But also in the future, people are also thinking about building giant radio telescopes on the moon as well. So if people have heard of the Arecibo radio telescope that actually recently collapsed in Puerto Rico. So it's this giant dish that was basically built into a valley. So it's a fixed radio dish pointing to the sky that collects radio data, or used to collect radio data. And so it was a great instrument, but obviously the Earth has a lot of radio noise. The sun has a lot, basically the Earth has a lot of radio noise. So people have been thinking about perhaps creating the same kind of Arecibo-like radio dish on the far side of the moon. And in doing so, then essentially the moon will block out all the radio noise from the Earth, and basically we'll have a stronger signal from space by doing that. And so if we build one of these giant radio dishes in a crater on the moon, we also need to know like how likely is it that an impact would actually destroy perhaps some of these guide wires, the actual suspended receiver, things like that. So how long could potentially this radio dish survive before we have to go maintain it or rebuild it or things like that? All right, so on the Earth, the Earth gets struck by about 73,000 pounds of meteoroids per day, okay? But most of them never reach the surface of the Earth. Most of them actually burn up in the atmosphere, right? And that's because we have an atmosphere. But that same amount of material, if that strikes the moon, there's no atmosphere on the moon, so all that material will actually strike the surface and create impact craters. So the way the numbers work is that basically a 10-pound meteoroid traveling at 45,000 miles per hour. So essentially 10 pounds, it's essentially the size of like a healthy cat, right? So if you have a cat traveling at 45,000 miles per hour and it's striking the moon, it's going to create a 35-foot diameter crater and will actually dig out about 165,000 pounds of lunar soil. So it can actually, so 10 pounds, so a 10-pound cat traveling very fast can actually create a lot of destruction, right? So we want to know how often this actually happens. And so in this GIF, you can see this flash of light in the basically on the left upper side of the moon, right? And this is actually a meteoroid strike on the surface of the moon, and it's traveling at such a velocity that it actually, when it strikes the surface, it heats up and glows for a short period of time, and so you see this flash. And so NASA actually has this program called the Lunar Impact Monitoring Program, where they're looking for large meteoroids, either a pound or greater, striking the surface, and they're trying to basically figure out the sizes and the rates of these strikes on the surface of the moon. And so I think the program started in 2005, and so the first kind of data dump from 2005 to 2008, you can see here on the left, and each one of these numbers is one of these meteoroid strikes on the moon, and now, well, the most recent data that I've seen in 2020, they've actually filled in a lot more. So you can see some of these numbers here. Here's like 428. So 428 strikes in about 15 years of a pound or greater on the surface of the moon. So it's not completely infrequent, but it's not very common though either. So it is something to consider, if we expand our presence on the moon. All right, so I will leave it there. So if you guys have questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Let's give Dr. Treuthardt a round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, same game. If you've got a question, raise your hand just like that. Excellent job. And I'll bring you a microphone. That way everyone in the room can hear and everyone watching on TV can hear too.
Will the Maria, I forgot how to pronounce it, will they ever go away?
Will the Maria ever go away?
Yeah.
Probably not, no. I mean, they're so large. Yeah, no, I think they'll just be there forever.
Good to know.
Why is the data on the previous slide is so kind of like, to the left and to the right, but then nothing in the middle?
Right. So yeah. So the way this works is obviously you can only see these bright flashes when on the side of the moon that's dark, right? So obviously you can't do this on a full moon. So it has to be some phase of the moon, and so essentially you just can't get data like right down the center of the moon. Yeah. So it should fill in there, so you could probably extrapolate that, but yeah, you can't collect that data. Oh, and I forgot to mention, NASA actually has telescopes that are doing this automatically, that are looking for these flashes. But this is also a potential citizen science project as well. So I think they do help you set up, if you have a telescope, and you have to have a video camera attached to the telescope. So it's not just still images. You have to record constant video. So you can get the flash of light and its decrease in brightness. But if you have a telescope and an attachable video camera, you can actually participate in this and keep track of these lunar impacts as well and submit the data to NASA.
Well, that's cool.
I just want to make sure that, when I go to sleep tonight, I have the correct takeaways here. So what I heard, which was, remarkable to me, is that the moon is kind of a chip off the block of the Earth, and it's been there for hundreds of millions of years with us, paired with us, dancing with us. But it's moving away, and that someday we're going to lose the moon. Did I hear that right?
That's right. Yeah. So initially, yeah, when the moon was formed. Well, so if we take all the data that we have now and say this is the evolution of the moon. So it started with a giant impact that coalesced, cooled, became an orbit around the Earth, and then you had the heavy bombardment and so on until today, right? So if we take all of that evolution of the moon to be true. Yeah, so what ended up happening was some object, Theia, size of Mars, struck the Earth, created the moon, and the Earth and the moon were actually much closer than they were than they are now. They were much closer together initially. Both were molten, both were cooling in the very, very early solar system. And then they became tidally locked. And when that happens, then basically there's conservation of angular momentum, which causes then the Earth's rotation to slow down, the moon's rotation to slow down, and by doing that, then they have to drift further apart in order to do that. And so that continues to happen today. And the rate isn't large, but it's measurable. And it's actually measurable by the due to the Apollo astronauts. So I don't know what Apollo mission it was, but one Apollo mission actually put what's known as a corner reflector on the moon, which is essentially half of a cube. So like three sides of a cube. I don't know if you know it can do it, but basically 3 sides of a cube, right? And they put that mirror on the moon, and people from Earth shoot lasers at it and can measure the distance to the moon, the distance to that corner reflector. And year over year, it's actually drifting away by about an inch. And that's because of the conservation of angular momentum, because of the tidal forces of gravity. Yeah. And so eventually, yes, the moon will drift away and we'll lose it, but I think the Earth will be swallowed by the sun essentially growing to a red giant before that happens. So yeah, so it's not tomorrow, it's not in human lifetime likely, but if you follow it to its logical conclusion, yes, it will lose it. Yeah. But let me also say this too, that will also eventually make solar eclipses harder to see because because we happen to be at like just, well, we're at a sweet spot right now with the distance of the moon being from the Earth, because it's now the same angular size as the sun. So the sun also takes up about half a degree in your field of view. And so when the moon passes in front of the sun, when it lines up perfectly and the moon is at the right distance, it will actually completely cover up the sun. So now as the moon drifts away, eventually what's going to happen is it's going to be too far away. So the angular size is going to decrease. And so then you'll be left with only annular solar eclipses, which are essentially what's known as the ring of fire, where the moon will block out the sun, but not completely, and you'll be left with still seeing edges of the sun around the moon. And then you'll always have to wear protective eyewear to look at a solar eclipse because it's not safe. Yeah, that's a long time. That's not tomorrow, yeah. But if you're planning for it, keep that in mind.
So that next eclipse is going to be good.
The next eclipse in 2024, it'll be good, yeah.
Hey, I had two questions, but they're both short. If an object Theia collided with the Earth to make the moon, what do we think happened to Theia?
Theia likely got absorbed either by the Earth. Well, Theia was likely destroyed, and I think it was. I think the thought is that it's absorbed by both the moon and the Earth. So that's why the compositions are the same. It's because it was basically spread out between both of them and created the same composition. So it no longer exists. It's completely incorporated into the moon and the Earth.
And two is, if the moon was formed by rocks hitting each other, why would a significant amount of water be there?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So actually, Rachel could answer that.
There's water. That's a really good question. So why is there water? Water is actually in rocks. So it's a common molecule in the universe. I mean, water is everywhere, and we're actually very dry by mass. The Earth is only 0.6% water. It's just that we're covered with water, so we think of it as a water planet, but it really isn't. But there's water inside the rocks of most of these, or all the terrestrial planets. And so even Venus had water. There's probably very little underneath in the crust, but all the water vaporized on Venus. But Mars has a lot of water. The moon has water, certainly, as Patrick said, on the poles, and in other rocks around the moon, and Mars also. But you get meteorites have water. Like you can. They're just in the molecular structure of like basalts and stuff. There's water that can be trapped in rocks, and so it's just a very plentiful molecule out there. Yeah.
And so I think a lot of it gets deposited by impacts. And yeah.
Hi, thanks for the talk.
Yeah.
Could you tell me a little bit about the volcanoes on the moon? Like, have we gotten a chance to analyze them, see them erupt? And have we learned anything about the core from those observations?
Yeah, so there are no active volcanoes on the moon. So all the volcanoes, basically the moon is essentially completely solid and dead. And so it's not really geologically active anymore. But there are measured moonquakes, which is, at least I'm not clear as to what causes them. I don't know if it's totally clear. I don't know if others, basically I don't know if it's clear what causes them. I know I don't know what causes them. But there are moonquakes, but essentially the moon is essentially solid all the way through. So there's no more, like the Earth actually has magma and lava and things like that, right? So it's still a really geologically active world, but the moon is not. The moon is essentially dead at this point. Yeah.
As somebody who pays attention to space news, what would surprise you to learn about the moon?
Oh, man.
AKA, what should I be looking out for in my social media feed?
What should surprise you about the moon? I don't know. To be honest, like I'm really interested in this Chinese U2 rover and what they're finding, because they're looking in the southern basin, the southern Atkin Basin, which has some of the lower elevations and really none of the mare, and so potentially the rocks that they're finding are going to be from deeper inside the moon, and so I think that's going to create a lot of interesting data. So I mean, the issue is that nobody is partnering with China to do this, so it's all of their data, and it's I don't know how open. I mean, they're publishing and things like that, but But it'd be nice if everybody was cooperating with each other. If NASA would cooperate with China and vice versa, it'd be fantastic, and I think we could get a lot more done. But I'm interested to see what more comes out of this Chinese rover mission, and what other things they find, because those old like mantle rocks that they think they found, I think that's actually pretty interesting, and that could tell us a lot.
Looks like we've got time for one more question. I guess in that same line, we should be getting a lot of our own really good news pretty soon once Artemis 3 makes it. And
yeah, so I'm really excited about Artemis 3, not only because of potentially looking at these craters with water in them and things like that, but also I just want to see high resolution video of people walking on another world other than Earth, and I think that's going to be awesome. I think it's going to be fantastic.
Does the mass of the moon increase or decrease with every impact?
Yeah, so I think it slightly increases. Yeah. I mean, material, like obviously, depending on the impact, the velocity of the impact, it is going to lose material to space. I mean, I think we also get moon rocks. We've also found some moon rocks on Earth because of that. I don't think large ones, but I think. Yeah, I think in general, essentially, it increases the mass of the moon. I mean, very slightly, but yeah, the net increase.
And if you visit the Museum of Natural Sciences Nature Research Center, 10 to 5, Tuesday through Sunday, you can see a lunar meteorite that the museum procured, that Dr. Smith got for us in 2020, I think, and that's on exhibit now. So we've got an Apollo moon rock and a lunar meteorite that you can come and visit with, and take pictures with, post on the internet. So let's give Dr. Treuthardt one more round of applause.
Thank you.
And thanks everybody for coming and taking in today's presentations with our guest speakers. Now, like I said before, we couldn't have a moon party without going and experiencing the moon as best we can. Representatives from the Raleigh Astronomy Club and some of our local NASA JPL Solar System ambassadors are out in the front of the museum here in the lobby, and then I think they were trying to set up out on the plaza as well. Some fun activities for us to take in for the rest of our 50th anniversary celebration. So thank you for doing this tonight, but we're not done yet. We can all head right outside and do some more Apollo programs. One more round of applause, please, for our guest speakers from Burning Coal Theater and from the museum. They did a great job. And thank you to our online viewers for participating. Hope that you enjoyed the program as well. Folks, make sure that you check out naturalsciences.org for more great, exciting events just like this one. We'll see you again next time. Good night.